Standing firm. In a secular as well as in a religious world that is more and more departing from biblical values, we are never to compromise the teachings of Scripture. Here's Gene.
As I think about this principle, I think about our own nation. I'm speaking as American. You may be hearing me somewhere in the world and you're not an American, but in the history of our country, if you go back far enough to the founding of our culture, basically, spiritual values and biblical values and our cultural values were almost identical. Doesn't mean we were ever a Christian nation per se, but it does mean that our nation was built upon the Hebrew Christian value system. But that's not true anymore. In fact, if I had to illustrate it, I'd illustrate it with these two overlapping circles. On the one hand, we have biblical values that never change. I believe that. They're absolute. But if you look at our culture today, we have moved. And so from the highest minds that lead us, we have changed the values of our culture in many instances that do not align anymore with biblical values. Now, Jesus obviously lived in that kind of world, not just within the Roman world, which was totally, in many respects, contradictory to biblical values and the values of the Old Testament, for example, and the values that Jesus was teaching. It wasn't just the Roman world, it was the Jewish world. It was the world in which Jesus moved. He was a Jew. And so consequently, when he was ministering to his Jewish friends and to those who are religious leaders particularly, both the secular and religious values had changed dramatically from biblical values. And we see that here. And we see Jesus as he goes back to the region of Judea across the Jordan. He's heading now towards Jerusalem, really for the last time. He's going to be crucified. And he goes back into an area where there's a lot of hostility. The Jerusalem area, the Judea area, there was tremendous hostility towards Jesus. At times when he was there, they tried to stone him, and he would disappear from their midst. His time was not yet. He'd go back to Galilee. But now he's heading back to this area. He's across the Jordan, and he's in an area where he's getting close to the place where John the Baptist actually baptized him and where Jesus began his public ministry. Now, something happened, but it's a setup by the religious leaders. In Matthew 19:3, we read this. Some Pharisees approached him to what? Test him. That simply means they're not sincere. They didn't approach him to learn. They approached him to test him. And they asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife on any grounds? Now, the fact is that Jesus, even 2 years before this on the Mount of Beatitudes, has addressed that whole issue of divorce, and they knew what he believed. And it was contradictory to what they believed, many of them. Remember when Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount said this in Matthew 5:32. He said, but I tell you, everyone who divorces his wife except in case of sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery. Now that's a whole theme in terms of divorce and remarriage and forgiveness, but that's not the issue that I want to deal with here, and that's not the issue Jesus is dealing with here. This is a setup. When they came and they asked him that question, because they did not believe the same thing that Jesus believed. What happens is that Jesus responds to them, and very directly. Now, I want to give you a little background here, and that is that Jesus is back in the area where John the Baptist confronted Herod, who was king over this area. And he had married illegitimately Herodias, which made her extremely angry And because of that anger, ultimately John the Baptist was beheaded, because he confronted that king relative to his immorality and his marriage that was out of the will of God. Now, I think the Pharisees, really in their own minds, they knew that story very well. And perhaps part of the setup was that they wanted the very same thing to happen to Jesus. They wanted to move in on him and take his life because he was teaching something about marriage that they totally disagreed with. And so here's Jesus' response, because they asked him about marriage and divorce. And what do you say? So here's his answer. Haven't you read, he replied. Now that's very significant. Haven't you read? What is he referring to? The Old Testament. They knew the Old Testament. And so he looks them right in the eye and he says, haven't you read, he replied, that he who created them in the beginning made them male and female? Quoting Genesis 2:24, Moses, whom they claim to follow. And he also said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two but one flesh. He quotes Moses, and then Jesus adds another dimension, and he says, therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Now, you need to understand something. The Pharisees followed a rabbi by the name of Hillel, who literally taught that you could divorce your wife for any reason. All she'd need to do is burn your toast in the morning for breakfast, if indeed they ate toast, or anything that she might do in disagreement, you could just simply say, I divorce you. By the way, there was another rabbi who was more liberal than this rabbi. And he taught that if there's another beautiful woman comes along and she's more beautiful than your wife, you can divorce legitimately and marry the more beautiful woman or the younger woman. Reminds me of our culture today, men who have wives, been faithful, have reared their children, have loved them and cared for them, and they dump them for a trophy wife. You know what I'm talking about. That happens even in our culture. Well, the Jews had come up with a teaching through these rabbis they could divorce for any reason. And so Jesus directs that. He does not compromise, and he says, this is what God says, and you, Pharisees, are violating the will of God. You've read it. You know what Moses taught. So he's very direct. He doesn't equivocate in relationship to the truth. And by the way, the apostles learned that, because in the book of Acts, on one occasion when they were taken before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council of 70, they said with boldness, we must obey God rather than man, because the Sanhedrin was teaching false doctrine in Judaism. So here we have an incredible illustration of taking a stand, being firm, not compromising what God says, even though the culture is totally changing. And there's no question that our culture, in many respects, has changed. We've violated, even though we have the Ten Commandments written on the Supreme Court, the building, and several places within, we still violate those commandments in certain respects. I was thinking about, for example, the vow that as men we take when we're asked, will you have this woman to be your wedded wife? To live together after God's ordinance, the holy state of matrimony, will you love her, comfort her, honor, and keep her in sickness and in health, and forsaking all others, give yourself to her so long as you both shall live? By the way, that vow comes directly out of the Church of England. It was brought here based upon a biblical statement, a biblical command. But compare what's happening today. If you go to some civic ceremonies, you certainly don't have a statement that reflects the value of permanency in marriage. And of course, in our society, we've actually changed the definition of marriage. And anyone who believes in the new definition of marriage, other than a one man, one woman, is ignoring Scripture and is totally contradictory to Scripture, because Scripture does not support that change in our culture. It's a violation of the will of God. So our values have changed. And so consequently, I think we need to take this principle very seriously, not only in relationship to marriage, but in relationship to many other aspects of our lives, where our values in our culture are changing and they're violating biblical values. Here's a question for application. Why do you think Matthew recorded Jesus' experience of blessing little children following his confrontation with the Pharisees regarding divorce? Well, this is conjecture, but here's what Jesus said, at least what Matthew has recorded sequentially. Then children were brought to Jesus for him to place his hands on them and pray, but the disciples rebuked them. Jesus said, "Leave the children alone." And by the way, another text said he was really agitated. And so he wasn't just quietly saying, "Leave the children alone." Jesus got in their face and said, "Leave the children alone. And don't try to keep them from coming to me." He said that to his disciples. Because the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. And after placing his hands on them, he went on from there. Now, as I said, this is somewhat conjecture, but I believe it's possible that Matthew literally included this sequence here with the children following Jesus' teaching on divorce, because he is saying to all of us that children are the ones who so often are hurt because of divorce. The fact of the matter is that some children, and most children, really believe that they're at fault. It's their problem. They caused this. And so what I think this is saying to us is that divorce is serious. I think there are biblical grounds for divorce, but I think it also says that we should never, ever put our children in the middle between the two people who divorce. They need healing. They need encouragement. They need help. So let's remember this very, very important principle that God has given us here that grows out of not only his teaching on divorce, but the story of the children. In a secular as well as in a religious world that is more and more departing from biblical values, we are never to compromise the teachings of Scripture.